question that I have that I find funny with what you've said is the fact that you say, had we gone in early on and been decisive, we could have possibly won the war. That seems to me to be contradictory to mostly everything that Ellsberg says in the Pentagon Papers, by saying that all along we underestimated the strength of the North Vietnamese. They'd been in a war for 20 years. They'd been in this kind of conflict for 20 years, and they hadn't fallen. Most of the Pentagon state that the early decisions by Kennedy and all these things know that they really weren't going to win the war, and they were an attempt to keep the war at a standstill. And also, even if had we gone in and taken over, were we going to be able to set up a government that was going to keep the country together or winning the war, when we couldn't even do it in half the country in South Vietnam? Especially considering that obviously seems to be the most popular leader is Ho Chi Minh. It seems to me that winning the war, what is winning the war here?
Okay, well, first, let me make it clear that I am not Ellsberg, and what Ellsberg was saying and what was said in the Pentagon Papers, he was not the sole contributor, obviously, to the Pentagon Papers. There were a great many people who contributed to that. But that's, in many ways, different than my own view. There are some areas where I agree with him. On your specific point, I was only conceding that if you're going to get involved militarily in an area, you ought to go in and do it quickly and not try to occupy the country or try to engage in the kind of a war that was taking place in Vietnam, which is essentially a war where you couldn't distinguish civilians from military, where there were many other forces involved, and we actually ended up becoming the biggest issue, and probably ended up uniting more of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Minh behind Ho Chi Minh at the time, because of our presence, which was an alien culture and an alien presence generally. But you could give a number of other examples where there were quick strikes. Something was done and you put somebody else in power and you got out, whether it's communists or non-communists or the United States. Eisenhower did something comparable to that in Lebanon in the 50s. It wasn't a question of going in and occupying, it was going in and taking a decisive action and getting out. I don't advocate that in retrospect. I don't think it would have worked. At least it wouldn't have bogged us down with all the casualties and the commitments that we made, including the commitments financially and economically that this country made. We haven't recovered from it yet. And I think it, at least whether it worked in the long run or not, it would have been a relatively brief and simple commitment by the United States, and then we could have undertaken to give them supplies and support one way or another, and gotten out and let the forces, the indigenous forces there, contend for who runs the country and what happens with the country. No, I don't think we should have done any more in Vietnam than give training and supplies and equipment, nor do I think we ought to do more than that in most areas of the world. It varies in different areas of the world because our vital interests are involved more in some areas of the world than others. In Southeast Asia, I don't think our vital interests were involved at all, as contrasted, for instance, to the Middle East, to Europe, to Central America on our borders, to Canada if something happened in Canada. There, I think you can make a strong argument our vital interests are involved. And that makes a tremendous difference. I do not think the military solution, whether decisive and quick or any other variation of the long-term commitment, would have worked in Vietnam. Even if we had made the commitment to go on for another 10 years after the 73 conclusion of the war, from our viewpoint, I don't think we would have been able to run Vietnam in an effective way. We'd have still had a rebel force going on, warfare going on, civil war within the country, and we would have been there, exposed with our men and our commitment of our treasure too.
We were talking a little bit about the different, the three presidents and where the whole conflict began and at what point. And a lot of talk has been said that, Kennedy undertook the conflict and that it was just the wrong time to lose the war. And so he kept the conflict going as a stalemate. And at one point, I don't remember if it was in the Ellsberg papers or not that I read, that he actually said that once he got reelected, he was going to get us out of this war. Johnson then took over when Kennedy was assassinated and felt the same thing. It was the wrong time to lose the war. He couldn't be the first president to lose the war, and also kept it going, pretty much knowing that he was never making a decisive action but keeping it a stalemate. Then Nixon takes over. He has the unique opportunity to get us out of the war by blaming it on the other party, which saying it was the Democrats' fault because he was a different party. He has a different position in the sense that he can get us out of the war in that way, and that's where a lot of his support came. One of the things that was mentioned to me in another class I had was my professor felt that Nixon's sole reason for escalating the war was actually to get reelected in 1972. Was the increase in the bombings, the increase in everything else. In fact, he would even go so far to say is that no part in the Nixon administration ever had any kind of had any real design or plan ahead of it. It was just simply a reaction to everything, and it was mainly based on being elected in 1972. Do you think there was a policy goal or an ideology behind all these actions? Or did the Nixon administration honestly feel they could win the war at this point? Or at least did they feel that they could get an upper hand for the purpose of negotiations? In other words, were they still underestimating the North Vietnamese? And did the administration truly feel that withdrawing from Vietnam would affect the U.S. position in the world? Did they feel that it was going to keep the that it was going to affect the U.S. position in the sense that we were letting down our allies? Did they truly feel that at this point?
I think quite a few of them truly felt that. I think it's an answer to your professor's comment in response to it, that Nixon did all this just to win re-election. I think that's a gross oversimplification. Nixon always had calculations as to what was politically popular, and anything he did and what was politically unpopular. So he probably was well aware that a president is normally backed by the American people and a strong commander-in-chief in taking military action. But I don't think that was anywhere near a primary motivation of Nixon at that stage, nor do I think it was of Kissinger or Laird or any of the others who were involved in that process. They all, I think, did believe that they could not afford to let Vietnam fall to the communists. They thought that was important. Whether they believed there would be a real domino effect or not, they did feel that the United States could not afford to lose this war. And certainly Johnson and Nixon felt they did not want to be the presidents presiding over the first defeat in the war by the United States, quote unquote. There was all of that patriotic fervor, which those of us who finally came to a conclusion to oppose the war had to contend with, because we then appeared to be unpatriotic. We were not supporting the boys over there, and we were ready to cave into communism. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, most of us who were taking that position were as strong or stronger anti-communists than the hawks. We just didn't feel that was the way to fight communism in the world, or to combat communism, to compete with communism. And so when you talk about the shouldn't be the Ellsberg papers, there was a book put out, the Ellsberg papers. It's really the Pentagon papers. It was called the Ellsberg papers book because it included a variety of papers that Ellsberg himself did write.
You mean papers on the war?
Yeah, papers on the war.
Yeah.
But in the Pentagon papers themselves, it was made quite clear that we could not win the war at that stage in any decisive fashion. And Ellsberg, as you know, always made the contention that he calls it the quagmire myth, that the presidents always knew they were informed. They made a conscious decision to go ahead anyway. And that we didn't just gradually get bogged down. And it's now the contention in the Westmoreland trial that the president was misled. That basically the presidents misled themselves. That they had the information. And the Pentagon papers pretty much documented the CIA reports that finally got to the president. They may have underrated the amount of troops and that kind of thing. That's the CBS documentary said, but there was plenty of evidence there for Johnson and Nixon particularly, that we weren't going to win this war quickly and decisively at that point. We were going to have to stay a long time on a long commitment of American troops and treasure, and that they consciously made the decision to keep it going another year or another
2 years. Come back to this question you asked about Nixon in '72 and whether they really thought they could win the war or not. I think all of them felt they might negotiate a settlement where there would be a relatively equal competition between the forces of South Vietnam and the forces of North Vietnam. There would continue to be sporadic military involvement, but that they would really sort of learn to live side by side, sort of like the North and South Korean solution, a division of some kind. I think they did believe that. They didn't, I think, feel that we could win a total victory, or the South Vietnamese would win a total victory and take over North Vietnam in the early stages. It would take a long time for that to evolve, if it ever did. But I do think that, however misled they may have been, that the people in Nixon leadership did believe they could negotiate a viable kind of a settlement. And there's good reason to believe they might have been able to do it at an earlier stage. But that the North Vietnamese were pretty much convinced by the time Kissinger was going through all his maneuverings and negotiations with them, that the North Vietnamese were convinced they were going to win anyway. We were negotiating from weakness, which made my position more difficult, because I could be accused of undermining the negotiations because the country was divided and was not standing firmly behind the president. How can you negotiate under those circumstances? Well, there's validity in that. Unfortunately, you have to make the kind of decision after the sacrifices that we had made and the sacrifices that were ahead of us, the lack of vital interest and a whole variety of other things involved in this. That the most important thing wasn't just negotiating a settlement from strength. We've been trying to do that for all those years, escalating our own military commitment and bristling and telling the communists how strong we are and demonstrating it by sending in 15,000 and 20,000 more troops in increments, and finally got 500,000 Americans over there, and that wasn't strong enough to negotiate from strength. You just ultimately come to a conclusion that theoretically that may be a good argument, but in practice it hasn't worked, and it's not going to work, and it isn't worth the price even if it did work over a long-term periods.
But you do feel that the Nixon administration did have some kind of ideology or plan. It wasn't just simply a reaction to events or whatever else. They were following something in all their policies.
I think it was both. I think sometimes, and when you say the administration, we have to be careful when we're talking historically about these things, or even in the present. It's not singular. Mm-hmm. There were different people who had different motivations. There were a lot of the military, for instance. I give you a number of examples of generals people who fought in Vietnam who believed very sincerely that we could win, certainly believed in what they were doing, and for good reason. I'm not saying that Americans are saints, but well, the communists are pretty tough hombres, and there were a great many things going on in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese, that I guess you would say, as somebody concerned about humanity, were very bad. There were a lot of good people in South Vietnam who wanted freedom and wanted to live in peace and have some rights, and that the communists repressed most of those rights and still do. I still remain firmly convinced that the best system in the long run for most countries is a system that will help them to move gradually to exercise of freedom. It's hard to say that you can exercise freedom immediately. We know we can't just plant our Constitution down over in some different culture and different system and have it take root and produce a democracy. In many instances, they probably need some kind of benevolent dictatorship over a period of time, evolve, but always evolving toward a greater exercise of freedom for all the people, where society produces more for all of the people. And that's very difficult to accomplish, obviously, in the world. I think that, well, I'll give you an example that sort of makes it much more specific instead of rambling around on this subject. General Walt was a Marine commander in Vietnam for 2 years, and he served on the Clemency Board with me in the 74-75 period. I was chairman of the Clemency Board, and he was appointed by President Ford. We had 9 members and then went to 18 members. General Walt was a very fine, decent person. From my observations of him, he was regarded that way by all the military people that I came in contact with. He was a soldier's general. He was out always worrying about his men. He set up orphanages for the Vietnamese children. He worked on the so-called Vietnamization programs for the people themselves. And he believed very deeply, and I'm sure rightly, there were an awful lot of wonderful, committed people in South Vietnam who believed in the United States and believed in freedom. General Walt believed we were letting him down. How do you argue with that, except to say we weren't really helping him in the long run? But you can't go over and deliver that kind of freedom by sending your troops in and by bombing and napalming and doing all the things we were doing. It has to be a more gradual process.
But you do feel that the Nixon administration, even in its process of going even into Watergate and things like that, was not solely just a reaction, but they had a plan. It wasn't just, there was some kind of design. It wasn't a designless type thing where they just did this, did that. And I mean, obviously Watergate cannot be, there was other people involved in Watergate. There was other things that were going on in situations. Certain people overreacting. And as you said, administration can't be just the administration. But
yes, I believe when you say the Nixon administration, I'll be more specific. I think overall the Nixon administration did have a design. They certainly did have to react, because nobody has complete foresight as to what's going to happen or what will be the result of given policies. So they tried one thing and they tried another thing, and it didn't work here and it did work there and then it didn't work here. So there is the reactive process that was taking place. They had an overall design. The overall design was to, when I finally broke with them, was to bomb the hell out of North Vietnam and then South Vietnam, and to reduce the draft so that they would reduce the opposition to the war in the United States domestically, and at the same time, while we were showing our willingness to escalate and do these things, we would negotiate with the North Vietnamese, and they would eventually respond as communists do, respecting strength, quoting now the Nixon administration approach, and they'd negotiate. They'd realize it was in their interest to negotiate. So a completely pragmatic approach. If we show them we'll do all these things and that we're tough enough, we'll stay with it, forget about all the peace movement and all the division in this country, we'll stay with it long enough that the communists and the North Vietnamese and perhaps the Russians would use their leverage and force the Vietnamese to negotiate by saying, well, okay, well, this is enough, we're supplying all this equipment to you and money and the rest, it's got to end here, that would work. I think that was their overall design. I think one of the fatal flaws in that kind of a design was, if you, for instance, take the Soviet Union, there's absolutely no motivation for the Soviet Union to want that war to end. No motivation for them to put any pressure on the North Vietnamese or anything else. Yeah, it was costing the Soviet Union money, maybe $500 million a year. At the time it was costing us $33 billion a year. Pretty good deal for the Soviet Union. It wasn't costing the Soviet Union any Russian lives. When we were sacrificing all of our American lives, 55,000 in the long final term, it wasn't dividing the Soviet Union, it was splitting our country apart. As I used to say in my speeches, if I were in the Kremlin, the last thing I would want is to have the war in Vietnam settled. It's a good deal for this communists, for this Russians.
In the House, from the research I did, I got the impression that Melvin Laird and Gerald Ford and you were all kind of, I don't want to say the Three Musketeers, that may not be right, but three of the, very close and doing a lot of different things, and three of the leaders of the House at the time.
It's true.
And then Laird then became Secretary for Nixon, Secretary of Defense. I guess the first question from there is what did you think about that? Not necessarily that he was Secretary of Defense, but his defense of his policies and things like that, having been at one point fairly close with him.
Well, he and I were never as close as Jerry Ford and I were, but we worked a lot together. We worked on the conservative papers. He sort of organized that, edited it. I wrote one of the chapters. He wrote one. We got different others to write things. And he was the conference chairman, Republican conference chairman, when Jerry Ford was minority leader and I was chairman of the Planning and Research Committee. And Les Aarons was one of the other leaders then, remained on as whip. And Mel and I did a lot of the work in organizing the various task forces on issues and so forth in the House, in
65, 66, 67. But Mel really was not involved in the two Ford revolts that Bob Griffin and I organized and ran to put Jerry Ford in originally as conference chairman and as minority leader. And then Mel became sort of an inside rival to Jerry Ford because Mel understood power very well, and he expanded the power of the conference chairmanship. Got the money funneling through the conference chairman and appointed all these task forces and so forth. Instead of having him under the minority leader, they were under the conference chairman. Everything generally being under the minority leader. The conference chairman had more authority than before. And when Mel went, he'd always been on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. He was always a very conservative, hawkish person, but also very pragmatic. And I think he was a good Secretary of Defense. It was difficult for me because Laird was Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War when I was in the Senate. And we obviously didn't agree on that because it was difficult for him also. Sure, it was difficult for him because he had children himself, and a lot of the children of friends, young people generally, opposed to the policies that he was espousing under Nixon, opposed to the war, essentially. And I called Mel Laird before I introduced S-3000, for instance, the amendment to end the war. Told him I was going to do it. Told Henry Kissinger in advance. And a variety of others. And Mel tried to talk me out of it. But Kissinger didn't. Kissinger just said, well, thank you for letting me know. And I'll tell the president. As though I wasn't going to tell the president myself. I did. And Mel came up with the word, coined the word Vietnamization for training and equipping the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, to fight for themselves. And there was more emphasis under Nixon and Laird in trying to train South Vietnamese. But it certainly wasn't a new policy. And hell, that's the way we started over there, training and equipping the South Vietnamese to fight for themselves. And it was certainly what Kennedy had in mind when he sent the troops over. And certainly was what Johnson wanted to have happen, too. But it turned out to be a good way of emphasizing the Nixon administration's desires to get out and have the Vietnamese handle it themselves. Generally, we remained friendly, but we didn't see a lot of each other, but that probably would have been true in any event. He was Secretary of Defense, very busy. I was Senator, very busy.
Well, I mean, I guess the next logical question to this is, I mean, you know, Melvin Laird went on to be Secretary of Defense, and then a few years later, Jerry Ford went on to be Vice President. And, you know, where do you think you might have fit in there had you, you know, been re-elected in 1970? I mean, what are the kind of things that you think might have happened?
If I'd stayed in the House, I'd have probably remained in the leadership. I don't think there's any question I'd been re-elected in 68 and probably thereafter I'd probably be re-elected in the House. And in that event, I might have been offered a cabinet position or position in the Nixon administration. I mean, Rumsfeld was also offered the OEO, went there, and a variety of other jobs, and eventually Secretary of Defense, and back in the White House with Ford. And I probably would have done that, and I certainly would have been offered something, or maybe even gone to the White House with Ford had I remained in the House. And there was an alienation, certainly, with all of those people, even Ford, on my policies in Vietnam and the positions I took in the Senate, generally the opposition to Nixon on the Supreme Court appointments and so forth. And it made it much more difficult, particularly with a conservative trend in the country, for any of them to appoint me to anything. And certainly Nixon had no desire to appoint me to anything. He was mad at hell. In fact, after all, he and Agnew actively tried to and succeeded, I guess, in purging me, certainly defeating me in the Senate. And so it certainly cut it off, those kinds of opportunities for me that I wanted to do it. If I had been elected in '70 to the Senate, then it would have been much easier to continue to be a major factor in the party. Such as John Sherman Cooper, Case, Javits, those people, while they were in office, remained very important factors. But you do need the base of public office normally.
Did you ever consider running again for the House back in Jamestown after the election?
Not seriously. They called me, Republican county chairman, several of them, and a variety of others from the district. And when Jim Hastings resigned suddenly, 74 or 5, I guess it was 75, and asked me if I considered running. And they wanted me to run. Then they had polls showing that I was the overwhelming favorite if I ran. And Stan Lundin basically passed word that he wanted to know whether I was going to come back because he wasn't going to run, and I did. And that's when they should have nominated your mother, but they messed all that up and nominated Jack Calkins, who turned out to be a very weak candidate, partly because he had been away from the district so long. And part of the reason they didn't nominate your mother was that they said they weren't ready for one candidate in New York yet. I think she'd been very good. At any rate, I thought about it at the time, but I had pretty much made up my mind I didn't want to stay in the House any longer. And I certainly didn't want to stay and retire from the House of Representatives and that sort of thing. There were other things I wanted to do. I doubt very much if I would have made such a decision not to run again for the Senate if I had been elected in '70 and then run again in '76. Been elected, I probably would have stayed in the Senate as long as I was elected. But I was a little tired of the House of Representatives at that point on what I'd accomplished. About all I really wanted to accomplish that didn't require staying on for a long time and getting the seniorities.
Do you think that the major reason for losing the election in '70 was was the war, was your stand on the war. I mean, obviously, Nixon and Agnew put a lot of money into it, and it was obviously a three-way race, which adds other things to the election. So it's not just a one thing. But I mean, do you think that was the major issue that caused the problem?
It was a major cause, yes. It was a major cause of the alienation of a lot of the Republican voters who were angry because I was opposing a Republican president. Had the election occurred in the spring of 1970, all the polls I had and all the polls Rockefeller had indicated I would have been reelected overwhelmingly. But that was before the Buckley defection and the Ottinger spending all the money. He was the only one in the Democratic primary who had money, and so he just completely took over the television commercials in the spring and early summer of 70. So he suddenly went from an unknown to somebody who was really very well known, purely on the basis of saturation of the television commercials. And then Buckley spent about $4 million from his campaign. Ottinger spent about $4 million, and I spent about $1.2 million. So that was a major factor. I think the Nixon opposition, Nixon-Agnew opposition, did more to defeat me than anything else. And ironically, I think the fact that I went on campuses, and although I was booed constantly because I was establishment, I wasn't up for out now as the radical students were demanding, I still was able to go on the campuses, and I became somewhat associated in the public's mind with the radical movement on the campuses. And I really went and told them they should stay as part of the system, and that we couldn't get out immediately, we just couldn't turn around. It took some time, but I was opposed to the war. Put simply, I think the Vietnam War itself, my position on the Vietnam War itself, was not what defeated me. Because by the time of the election in 70, about 70% of the American people were kind of finally opposed to the war. So I don't think they were voting on that issue alone. They were influenced by the Nixon-Agnew opposition to me. Some of them, Democrats, liberals, influenced favorably to me. But most of them, Republicans, very strongly against. And so I really lost the election by losing the Republican base support. And the reason that Nixon and Agnew opposed me, however, was my position on the war.
Mm-hmm.
It's once removed.
I think there's one more question, and I think I'll turn to Dave. I guess the final question is what do you think would have happened to the anti-war movement had you not been there? Do you think that it was necessary that for a Republican figure to take a stance against the war in order for the movement to be legitimized? And do you think if you hadn't been there, somebody else would have done it?
A lot of people, other people were doing it in different ways. George McGovern was at that time, and he and I led the parade, the March on Washington in November of '69. And we gave some legitimacy to that because there were a lot of radical, extreme elements demanding immediate withdrawal.
trashing on Nixon and all of that stuff. And a lot of middle America did participate in that demonstration because we were legitimate figures involved in it. But the answer to your question is no. I think the anti-war movement would have continued and would have been there without me. I don't presume to think that I made that much of a difference one way or another. When I introduced S3000, however, in September of '69, I couldn't get a co-sponsor. Gene McCarthy said it's a little too radical for him. And I couldn't get Hatfield or McGovern or anybody else to co-sponsor that bill because they were just putting in resolutions to say that we ought to negotiate or we ought to have a ceasefire or stop bombing or whatever else. And mine was the first one that put our aggression feet to the fire and said, why don't we cut off the funds a year from now? By the next August, we had a vote in the Senate in August of '70, and there were 40 votes in favor of basically what was my amendment to end the war. And Governor Hatfield, so-called amendment at that point. But I would say that, as far as I'm concerned, being in public life at that point, I would have found it very difficult to live with myself without having done everything I could, gotten in to try to help. I had a greater opportunity to do something than the average citizen did, obviously, even the leaders of the anti-war movement, because I had a forum from which to speak as a United States Senator. To live through that period and not try to do everything I could was just something I couldn't accept when I finally realized what Nixon's policy was going to be, and it was going to be continuing in Vietnam for a long period of time.
Do you think the fact that you were a Republican opposing the war was important? Not necessarily Republican figure in office.
Very important. That's one of the reasons it made Nixon and Agnew so angry, because they couldn't say that the opposition to the war was partisan. And that really angered them tremendously. If I had been a Democrat, you could have said this is all a partisan issue. Democrats are trying to exploit our boys fighting overseas and all of that kind of thing. Made it Senate a bipartisan issue. Not that people like Javits and later on Case and Hatfield and some of the other Republican senators were not expressing their doubts about the war, but suddenly a Republican senator was the first one to introduce an amendment to the war and taking a leadership position on it. That was a little different. And so I do think it made it bipartisan, the opposition to the war bipartisan in that respect, and it was important.
Do you think someone else would have taken up that?
I don't know of any other Republican senator, and I don't know of any other Republican in high office at the state level. And I don't know of any other Republican in the House that would have had any forum to do it. There were some Republicans in the House opposed to the war, Republican members of the House, but none of them were in a position to offer an amendment to end the war or do anything of that nature. Partly because in the House you couldn't get an amendment on the floor. The restrictive rules in the House have great difficulty getting. Plus, there's much more discipline members in the House, and the House was a more conservative body at that point in the war. There was a lot of Democratic before World War II. But people like Pete McCloskey were opposing the war. When I was in the House, they were opposing the war. And Pete was a Marine, fought in Korea, and used to talk to me at great length, trying to convince me we ought to get the Republicans in the House and the leadership to oppose the war. He just didn't have at that point, didn't have the platform and the forum that you do in the Senate. As Teddy Roosevelt said, the White House is a bully pulpit. Well, the Senate is a bully pulpit too. Much better than the House.
Mm-hmm. I guess the only last thing I would ask is, I mean, that's all the questions I have. Is just, you know, if there was other things you wanted to add, or what you felt, or what, you know, how you thought about do you think it covered most of everything, or were you surprised, or were you?
The only thing I'd add, I think we've covered most of this ground quite thoroughly, and there are a lot of details. Go into, they're not particularly relevant. The only thing I'd really add is that I think that the opposition to the war was a very traumatic thing for me personally, because I had, throughout my career, worked within the system, within the Republican Party. I led revolts on the leadership. I tried to develop programs to get task forces and positive programs and alternatives, all of that kind of thing. Try to get the Republicans to support things like the manpower retraining and equal pay for women in 1963 and so forth. But it was always as a Republican member of the establishment. And the opposition to the war was really a break with the Republican president and with the Republican leadership, Eb Dirksen, the minority leader in the Senate at that time, and he was sitting down with Lyndon Johnson all the time, supporting him on practically everything, working out compromises, so-called, or deals. And Hubert Humphrey had been elected president in 1968. And I opposed Hubert Humphrey. He pursued the same policies Nixon did, or continued in the war with different policies. And I, as a Republican senator, had opposed him. I won overwhelmingly, because that would have brought a lot of liberal Democratic votes to my side, and I would have been holding the Republican base because I was opposing a Democratic president who was running an unpopular war. As a Republican senator, by opposing a Republican president, I was a defector, disloyal.